is Victoria, and I'd like to tell you the most horrible story of my life. I grew up as a very curious and active child. My parents often told me off for touching things I was not allowed to touch, so I made sure they didn't know I wasn't always a well-behaved girl. I didn't understand why they were so worried. I used to enjoy playing with a knife and imagine myself being a pirate or a circus girl who threw knives at a moving target. Fortunately, I never injured myself and put the knife back to where it belonged to. No one ever saw me playing with it. I liked the idea that I could just play with something that my parents forbid me to take, and that was my little secret. Once my parents invited their relatives and friends to our house. In the middle of the party, someone left a lighter in the kitchen, which I noticed immediately. I wasn't sure how it worked, but I saw my father's friend lighting a cigarette. Of course, I wanted to try and play with it. I took the lighter from the kitchen and hid in the storeroom. It was easy to understand how to use it. I also found out that the flame volume was adjustable. I imagined myself to be an astronaut in a spaceship which was flying through space, deviating from asteroids and looking for abandoned civilizations. Finally, I was able to find a planet that seemed to have been inhabited. I took a couple of bottles in the corner of the storeroom and turned them into an abandoned spaceport. I started landing. The last thing that I remember was a flash of light, severe burning, and silence. I woke up in the hospital. I was lying in a bed with my body totally covered with bandages. My mother was sitting beside me. Her eyes were full of tears. I could hear my father shouting at someone over the phone in the corridor. It was a long recovery. I isolated myself and didn't want to talk to anyone. At first, my parents didn't worry a lot about that. But when a year passed and nothing changed, they took me to a psychiatrist. By the time I was 14, I made great progress. I felt better. I could talk again, study, even do sports. But sudden flashes and noisy sounds still made me frightened. As for fire, I couldn't even think of approaching to it. I wasn't even able to use the gas stove, so my father bought an electric one to help me with cooking. That day, my mother was arguing with my father about the fact that he couldn't find time to repair the door to the basement where we had a washing machine. It was Saturday, the day my mother did laundry. When I returned from school, I saw smoke coming from the house. I rushed to the front door, opened it, and saw clouds of smoke inside. Smoke was everywhere, but the fire was insignificant. It must have just started. I heard my parents in the basement. The door was closed and they couldn't get out. They were knocking hard on the door and begging for help. I moved towards the door, but saw fire very close to it. I got paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move, but the fire kept spreading. Soon, the entire wall with the door to the basement where my parents were was burning. But I still wasn't able to do anything. My body didn't obey, my head was spinning, and the only thing I could think about was running away. Running away right now. Although I knew that we kept an axe and a fire extinguisher in the storeroom, I couldn't dare to move. Feeling helpless, I closed my eyes. It helped. My fear subsided, and I took the fire extinguisher from the storeroom, and I rushed to the corridor to put out the fire. I directed the fire extinguisher to the places with the most aggressive flame, and it was reducing. I was moving to the door to the basement. At that moment, I realized I couldn't hear the voices anymore. I grabbed the axe and began hitting the lock with it. When it was finally broken, I opened the door and saw my parents. They were still breathing, but couldn't speak. By the time I was already feeling dizzy and could hardly move my legs, I understood that I had to leave the house as soon as possible. I started pulling my parents out of the house, repeating again and again, "Please, hurry, please." But they were nearly unconscious and couldn't move. I was pulling both of them, but I felt I was getting weaker. There was just a few meters left to the porch. I woke in the hospital. I opened my eyes and saw a nurse. I asked her about my parents. She said, "I'm sorry, I'll call a doctor for you." I refused to believe that the worst thing had happened, but the doctor confirmed the fact that my parents had died. He asked me if I had any relatives who could take care of me. I said that I didn't, and then I began crying. I was hysterical, actually. The doctor gave sedatives to me and I fell asleep. When I woke up a few hours later, a man was sitting near my bed. He was holding my hand. I withdrew it and asked who he was. He replied, "Don't be afraid. I'm your uncle." The conversation that we had after that turned my life upside down. He was my uncle, the man who was guilty for the explosion in the storeroom when I was little. He said that I had been playing with his bottles, remember the spaceport, that contained highly flammable substances. My father blamed my uncle for what had happened to me. He was so angry that he cut my uncle from our lives completely, removed all photos, letters, messages, and I was too little to remember him. During all this time, my uncle was tormented with guilt. But when he got the news about the fire and my parents' death, He immediately came to visit me at the hospital. When our neighbors entered the house full of smoke, they found me in the corridor with a fire extinguisher in my hands. I was unconscious. I often think that if not for the smoke, I had had all the chance to save my parents. I lost my parents. I blamed myself and felt miserable. My uncle became my legal guardian and I started living with his family. I spent months in my room without leaving it, but time passed and my pain dulled. Besides, my uncle and his family were really nice people who helped me return to a normal life. I am no longer afraid of fire. Moreover, I decided to become a fire safety officer, because the best way to fight a fire is to eliminate all possible causes of ignition. Well, that's the end of my story. Take care of your beloved ones and always follow fire safety rules. Please, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.